I've been hearing it for days now. The same ringing, echoing in the back of my mind, even when my phone isn't near me. No matter what I do, I can't escape it. The thing is, the calls aren't from anyone I know. They're from me. It started on a rainy Thursday afternoon when I found an old, dusty mobile phone at the bottom of a box in my grandmother's attic. She had passed away just a few months earlier, and I was helping my parents clear out her house. The phone wasn't anything special, a cheap flip-style model with a cracked screen and faded buttons. But there was something about it that caught my eye. It seemed out of place among the old photos, expired medications, and worn-out furniture. I picked it up and flipped it open. Surprisingly, it still worked. The screen lit up, showing the time, 3:17 p.m. Curious, I opened the contacts list, but it was empty. The only number saved on the phone was a single, strange sequence of digits. 0420-369-5527. At first, I thought it was just a random number, maybe a mistake or a forgotten contact from the past. But as I stared at it, something about it unsettled me. The longer I looked, the more I felt a strange pull toward it, as if the number was calling me, urging me to do something. I hesitated for a moment, but then did what any curious person would do. I dialed the number. The phone rang only once before it was answered, the sound sharp and clear, despite the phone's ancient, weathered appearance. But when I said hello, there was no response, just a long, eerie silence. Hello, I repeated, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. Help, the voice rasped. I froze. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. Who is this? I asked, my voice shaking. The line went dead. The phone screen went blank, and I was left staring at nothing but static. Confused, I ended the call and tried to dismiss it as some weird glitch or prank. But that night, as I lay in bed, the ringing started again. It wasn't from my phone. I checked. It was silent, but the ringing echoed in my mind, as though it was coming from inside my head, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. My heart raced. I could hear my own voice calling out for help in the background, distorted and muffled. It wasn't possible. I was alone in my room. When I woke up the next morning, I thought it had all been a bad dream. I went through my day as usual, but something had changed. The ringing was still there, just beneath the surface of everything. I couldn't escape it. It was like a constant, maddening hum in the back of my mind. I checked my phone again. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages. The only thing that had changed was the contact list. It now contained a new entry, 0420-369-5527. The number was there again, as if it had always been. I had never added it myself. I hadn't even been near the phone after the call last night. My hands trembled as I dialed the number once more. The phone rang only once again before being answered. This time, the voice was clearer, but the words sent a jolt of panic through me. You don't belong here. I quickly hung up and turned the phone off, thinking that would be the end of it. But that night, the ringing came back, louder and more persistent than ever. I tried everything I could think of, turning the phone off and on, resetting it, even tossing it in a drawer and locking it away. But no matter what I did, the sound of that ringing was always there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. And then, something strange began happening. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up to the phone ringing. It wasn't from my phone, but from somewhere else, somewhere close, but just out of reach. I could hear my own voice again, but this time it was clearer. It's not over. It's not over. It's not over. The message played on a loop, the same phrase repeating endlessly, and as the voice repeated, it began to sound more and more like me, until I could no longer tell the difference. I rushed to my phone, terrified, and saw something that made my blood run cold. The phone was turned off, but somehow, It was ringing as though it were alive. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The screen lit up, showing the same number. 0420-369-5527. I answered it, but there was no voice on the other end. Instead, I heard my own voice again, as though I were speaking to myself from the other side of the line. "You're not going to leave, are you?" my voice asked. I dropped the phone in terror, but it didn't stop. The voice continued, louder now, until it was practically screaming. "You're never going to escape me." The room grew cold, the air thick with the sound of the ringing. I tried to flee, but no matter where I went, the sound followed me. I could feel it inside my head, scratching and clawing its way to the surface. I ran out of the house, desperate to escape, but the ringing never stopped. It was there when I stepped outside, in the alleyways, the streets, the parks, always following me, always growing louder. And then, as I walked through the park near my apartment, I found myself staring at something that made my blood freeze. A group of people stood in a circle, their heads tilted toward the ground. In the center of the circle, glowing in the darkness, was the same phone. The phone rang again, the same number flashing across the screen. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I reached for it. As my fingers touched the screen, the world around me went black. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own voice, no longer distorted, but crystal clear. "You finally come home." The words echoed in my mind as my vision returned. I was standing in the middle of the park, but everything had changed. The streetlights were flickering. The trees twisted in unnatural shapes and the air felt wrong, thick, heavy. The people around me were still standing, their eyes fixed on the phone. Their faces were expressionless, yet their movements seemed mechanical, as though they weren't entirely human. The ringing was louder than ever now, resonating through the ground beneath me, vibrating in my chest. My body felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. My fingers reached toward the phone, but I couldn't stop them. It was as though something was pulling me toward it. When I touched it, the screen flickered. The number 0420-369-5527 was no longer on the screen. In its place was a single word: home. I couldn't breathe. I looked around, but the faces of the people around me seemed to melt into shadows, their features blurring, as if they were never real. The phone felt warm in my hand now, alive in a way that was terrifying. Then, a voice whispered in my ear, "We've been waiting for you." The sound of the ringing started to distort, warping into something else, something familiar. It was my own voice, calling for help, but it sounded wrong, twisted, desperate, like a cry for help trapped inside an endless loop. It was like my voice had been stolen, its echoes forever trapped in that cursed number. I tried to run again, but it was no use. The ringing surrounded me. It consumed everything. My thoughts, my sanity, my very sense of reality. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was everywhere. The last thing I remember was hearing that voice again, clearer than ever, as it whispered in the darkness. "This is your home now. You're never leaving." And then there was nothing. I don't know how long I was gone, but when I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The phone was still in my hand, but it was now silent. The number was gone. There were no messages, no contacts, no more haunting calls. But the ringing, it hasn't stopped. It's still there, in the back of my mind, echoing through the silence. And sometimes, late at night, when I look at my phone, I swear I can see that number, 0420-369-5527. It's waiting for me. The days that followed felt like a blur. I tried to ignore the sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I went back to work, saw friends, pretended everything was normal. But the ringing, it never stopped. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts, creeping into my every waking moment. The ringing was louder now, almost like a constant hum in the back of my mind. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Something insidious, haunting, always waiting to resurface. Every time I checked my phone, the number 0420-369-5527 was gone. But I knew it was still there. In the quietest moments, I could feel it, a weight pressing down on my chest. The phone, now stored away in a drawer, felt like a ticking time bomb. I couldn't let it go, couldn't throw it away. It was as if the phone had become a part of me, connected to my very soul. And then one evening, something happened. I had just finished a late night shift at the office, exhausted from the day's work. My apartment was dark and quiet as I let myself in, the soft glow of streetlights filtering in through the windows. I tossed my keys on the counter and sank into the couch, my mind a haze of exhaustion. But then the ringing started again, not from the phone, not from anywhere specific. It was inside my head, louder than ever, piercing through the silence. I could feel it vibrating through my skull, rattling my brain. I could hear it, but no one else could. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. The ringing was unbearable, louder than it had ever been, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to answer it. I had to find out what it wanted. I rushed to the drawer, pulled the phone out, and opened it. The screen flickered to life, and once again, 0420-369-5527 flashed across the screen. I hesitated, staring at the number. My fingers trembled as I reached to dial it, but before I could press the button, the phone rang. The same eerie mechanical sound. It rang once, then twice. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly I answered. A cold, metallic voice answered on the other end. It was distorted, echoing in a way that felt unnatural, like it was speaking from far away, from somewhere I couldn't comprehend. "You can't escape." I tried to speak, but no words came out. The ringing was deafening now, pounding in my ears, taking over my thoughts. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. And then the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't the cold, mechanical tone. It was my voice. "We're the same." The words rattled around in my head, twisting and turning, until they started to make sense. I felt a terrible pull, like the phone was drawing me into its orbit, pulling me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. "We've been waiting for you," I gasped, clutching the phone so tightly my fingers went numb. The voice, my voice grew louder. It was as though it was coming from inside my head, filling every space, drowning out everything else. "You knew this day would come," the voice whispered. I couldn't handle it anymore. I slammed the phone down, but the ringing didn't stop. It didn't stop. The phone screen flickered again, this time showing something different. The numbers on the screen seemed to shift, distort, like they were warping and twisting in on themselves. I couldn't make out the words anymore, only symbols, strange, alien shapes that felt ancient, like they didn't belong in this world. I looked away from the screen, but I couldn't escape the sound. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something I didn't understand. Something wrong. The ringing was louder now, and it wasn't just in my head. It was everywhere. It filled the entire room, vibrating through the walls, the floors, the air itself. I could feel it inside my chest, my bones vibrating with the force of it. I backed away from the phone, my heart racing. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But before I could turn to run, the lights flickered, and then the door slammed shut. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the phone, the cursed phone, still lying on the counter. The screen was now completely blank, save for the words that slowly appeared across the darkened display. "You're not alone." A cold gust of air swept through the room, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. I turned back toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge. The wall seemed to close in, pressing in on me. The ringing was so loud now I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones. Suddenly, the air felt thick, like I was breathing through something heavy. The walls seemed to shift, distort, like they weren't quite right. The familiar layout of my apartment started to change. The furniture shifted ever so slightly, as though the space around me was warping, twisting into something darker, something more sinister. I turned back toward the phone, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I was drawn to it, and I knew, deep down I knew, that I was never going to be able to leave. This place, this nightmare, was where I belonged now. It had always been waiting for me, and as I stepped toward the phone, my own voice whispered once more, this time from every corner of the room, "You'll never leave. We've always been here." The walls, the air, the phone, everything seemed to close in on me. The ringing swallowed everything. The light, the sounds, the air itself. There was no escape, only the sound of the ringing, louder and louder, until it consumed everything. And then nothing. The ringing was gone, but I could still feel it. I could still hear it. In the silence, it was there, inside my head, beneath my skin, in the very core of my being. The phone was still in my hand, and I knew, deep down, that it was calling me again. And this time, I had no choice but to answer. End.